I think in your column this week, one of my, I think one of the points that I want to bring forward is while the word stagflation gets thrown around, it's not in your column. But what you're talking about is maybe a precursor to stagflation. Could you talk about what stagflation is and then talk about some of these numbers, that you're seeing?
What's in the word stagflation is stagnation and inflation, right? And it's basically a slowdown in economic growth, maybe an uptick in the unemployment rate. So imagine an economy that's potentially contracting, and yet you have high prices are elevated and rising fast, right? And that's probably the worst of the worst.
When is the last time that we experienced, for context, when's the last time that we experienced stagflation in the United States?
Mid-1970s, 70s oil crisis, when basically inflation was crazy high, interest rates were crazy high, and the labor market was contracting.
So at the end of the Carter administration, at the beginning of the Reagan administration, I can tell you, having lived through that period of time and having grown up in Western Pennsylvania, which was going through its own somewhat of like a micro downturn because of industry. I mean, the steel industry was just about, blown up at that point. It was miserable, absolutely miserable.
Right, exactly. And I mean, can you imagine, right? The job prospects are dwindling. And at the same time, the price of everything is rising rapidly. I mean, this is the worst of the worst possible economic scenario, and one that we should do everything we can to try to avoid.
Yeah. All right. So what else is in your column this week? Let's get into the data.
The main event this week is going to be the release of the consumer price index and producer price index, right? And those releases are going to basically aim to answer the question: are we beginning to see some of the tariff-induced price pressures at a time where consumer demand is slowing down?
We're going to talk a lot about tariffs over the episodes that we record this week, and I mean we'll get into sort of all of that. So let me ask you this: so like your observation of the consumer price index (CPI). It increased just 0.08% in May. That's a sharp drop from the 0.2% in April. Okay, that would seem to be pretty good. Core CPI increased by just 0.12% in May, half of what it increased in April. Again, that seems to be trending
We love those numbers. We love those numbers.
But let's go and talk about PPI real quick, because I'll turn you loose. Okay, the producer price index, the cost of creating the goods that we buy, like in the marketplace, rose 0.4% in May. So we got things that are kind of going in different directions here.
For finished consumer goods, and this is the part where we're like worried, right? Because that's the part that's directly impacted by the tariffs, right? Like all the stuff that we're importing from abroad. And so, although the PPI was going in the right direction, all of a sudden we're starting to see wholesale prices going in the opposite direction, especially for finished consumer goods, right? After a couple of months of declines, we're now seeing an uptick in the price of finished consumer goods. And that's worrying because as cost to producers increase, right? As well, the prices consumers face are also expected to increase, right? Usually what you do as a wholesaler is you pass on some of your higher costs to retailers, right? And so I think that's the fear. And
everything comes back to the consumer.
Exactly. Everything goes back to the consumer. And that's the fear. So we're going to see those numbers come in, and hopefully the CPI is still somewhat, at least headed in the right direction. We're worried that might not be the case. And then you also have retail sales data that's coming up this week. And so you'll see in the retail sales data, well, are consumers still spending, or are you at a point where, you got these prices rising and consumers are also pulling back at the same time? So that's going to be very interesting. Okay, of course, remember in the CPI, you have prices of other things that could be pulling the CPI lower. And hopefully enough to offset any increase in the price of goods, especially those exposed to tariffs.
Let's talk about what you're picking up in the housing market right now. I mean, obviously, you spend a tremendous amount of time, that being the core focus of the work that you do, in your consideration of the economy as a whole. You wrote this week, builders are very good at forecasting housing demand. This month's housing starts report also will be revealing if fewer housing units are started, construction sector employment can continue to decline. Last month, residential construction employment fell 0.1% and is now just 1.7% higher than a year ago, a significant decline from the 2.6% higher year over year to start the year. So what is your take on that?
So, this year we had a lot of uncertainty that kept buyers on the sideline. Inventory is up 20% relative to last year. So as inventory accumulates, builders are trying to sell units. And so if sales growth is slow, right, if they're not able to sell at a faster pace and get rid of these units, essentially, they're not going to start new units. They're not going to start building new housing units. And if they don't start building more housing units, what tends to happen is employment in that sector will contract. Right? Builders are not going to be, they're not building new units, so they're not going to be hiring more workers to get those units done. But there's also orders of like bathtubs and tiles and, lumber. All of that stuff goes down when builders are not building new housing units. And so the employment could be affected, right? And so we're already at a point where the labor market was slowing, right? Where the duration of unemployment is rising, continuing unemployment rates are the highest they've been in a long time. And now you're starting to see like the few industries like construction, healthcare, right? Those were the few industries that were creating jobs last year, right? Other than the government sector. Well, those industries are also now starting to slow down. And so the labor market is weakening pretty rapidly. And of course, a slowdown in housing sales will actually show up in the labor market. By the way, historically, a decline in housing starts has been somewhat predictive of the business cycles, right? Declines in business in activity and economic growth, sometimes even a kind of a leading indicator of whether or not we're going into a recession. The risk of recession is of course rising.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you, just looking ahead at the balance of the economic calendar, you don't get into this in your column. If you ever wanted to hear a Fed governor or somebody from the Fed speak, you're going to get your wish this week. It looks like literally everybody at the Fed is going to be standing on a podium offering information about something. So it should be, including your guy.
I think my favorite, of course, is Governor Christopher Waller.
I was just going to say, speaking on Thursday night, I imagine that you'll probably.
I would pay attention to that. I would absolutely pay attention to that. Again, I say this because in terms of research, he is the authority on the topic, right, of monetary policy. And so I would pay attention to his assessment of the U.S. economy. Whenever he speaks, I think markets listen, and ultimately, when people talk about who the next Fed chair could and should be, I can't think of anyone more qualified than Governor Waller.
Well, that's for those of you who are appointment watching that 6:30 p.m. Eastern time on Thursday night.